Do you feel like you're running out of time? Are you able to stop time? If so, how? Welcome to About Time, an audio series from the Rubin Museum of Himalayan Art that aims to reframe the concept of time and perhaps our perspective on life. I'm your host, Tim McHenry. Many objects in the Rubin's collection of Himalayan art reflect the Buddhist concept of the present, highlighting the illusory nature of the past and future. In this four-part series, performance artist, electronic music pioneer, filmmaker, and all-around creative genius Laurie Anderson curated a series of conversations to tackle questions about time. Laurie's guests were poet Jane Hirshfield, novelist Tom McCarthy, philosopher the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi, and writer Benjamin Labatut. This is a recording of a 2024 in-person program, one of many organized and hosted by me at the Rubin. In this episode, we hear Laurie Anderson engage with the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi, the president and CEO of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. One of the leading arguments put forward in favor of having AI in our lives is that it will save us all time. What will we do with the time that we're given? And does that freed up time have a moral value? So many questions. Too little time.
I have millions of questions for you, but one of the things you said, and I'll just read one sentence from your book, you're quoting a teacher who said, "Don't ask questions," he would say. No, the answer is not where you're looking. That's a dead end. Look further and deeper, refine your questions. So I went through all my questions and I was like, oh, well, I don't have time to refine these questions. They're all going to be a little bit idiotic. But, one of the things that we were talking about in the earlier sessions here was how divided many cultures are now, especially our own, in terms of, you could think of it in terms of time. Half of the people, or maybe roughly half, are thinking, it's too late. And the other half are thinking somewhere in the past, if we could just get back there, it's okay, and then we could be there again. So when we're going to be coming back and forth to that idea, but I'd like to begin by asking you what it's like to be teaching ethics at MIT.
I think the intersection of time and space of exploring ethics. I think we're at a time when it's most relevant in a place like MIT, because the field of science and technology has taken pride in itself since its inception. I would say at least in the last 100 years, this blend of science and technology, for being amoral. By design, that the idea is that it should not take sides and it should think about bigger questions. But now, increasingly, especially after the projects during the Second World War, the atomic bomb designs and so on. And since then, now that certain technology that has entered consumer life, social media, and certain aspects of those platforms that is posing challenges and threat to civic institutions, you need to start thinking about who or which agency should be held responsible or feel some sense of responsibility about it. And that's where I think this question of ethics is important. And I don't do normative ethics. I don't want to tell people or dictate them about ethical life and so on. The way the center and I approach ethics is more around the idea of promoting ethical imagination. And that's the expression that I like to use. It's primarily giving them certain tools and creating an environment where they can collectively and individually reflect on the idea of what would it mean to truly introduce certain ethical principles. So if you're designing something, rather than the way companies work, which is you design, you deploy. If something goes wrong, then you start thinking about, well, what we could have done. Here, thinking of ethics at design stage itself. So not thinking of ethics as a block in this road to discovery or invention, but thinking of it as a added variable that allows us to make things better in a certain manner. So ethical imagination is what I would say. It's not even so much about teaching ethics,
Right.
but creating new models for learning ethics.
Yeah. It's interesting that you use the word deploy, because that's one of the things that does scare me a little bit about corporate language getting so many of their terms from the military, as we do too. I copy that, and people are like, yeah, let's hit the ground running with that one. And you're just moving furniture around an office. You're not really, it's not a military campaign, but we've got this vocabulary that we have to fight somehow. But in terms of design and ethics, that just reminded me of something I haven't thought of in a really long time. It's a quote of Lenin, which he said, "Ethics is the aesthetics of the future." And I've always been very puzzled by that. I mean, I love this idea that then in the future we'll just all be good to each other, and that will be enough. That will be just beautiful enough, and we won't have to design anything or make beautiful stuff or art or things like that. On a design level, what do you think of that sort of connection between ethics and aesthetics?
I think it's a very sort of intimate connection, because I think deep down ethics also evokes questions of observation, beauty, the sense of harmony, synergy. Those are all sort of, again, it can be a functional design question, but they're primarily questions of aesthetics. How to make things actually better.
Right.
Because again, ethics in some ways is a human invention. It's a human construct. You don't find ethical norms, for example, in other species. We can project and say animals respect each other, or they may respect boundaries and so on, but it's largely a human construct.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about some of the kind of wellness programs that are going on, because I think so many of them have that economic model of, I'm going to be a better person on this sort of cost-benefit analysis level of, how I'm going to spend my time. That type of training.
Sometimes when, I'm sure when you get invited to speak, people want to know 5 bullet points that the audience is going to walk out of.
Could you give us those 5 bullet points?
I hate that. I literally hate that.
Okay.
I'm like, why do you have to put it in the context of audience walking out with 5 things? Why not audience came in and they dropped 10 things? Why does it have to be accumulation of 5 things rather than dropping 10 things? Right. But it's such a consumer mindset, that we have become accustomed to, that even, you're coming to a Buddhist teaching on emptiness and you want to know what are the 5 things you can walk away with. I mean, it's just,
you can get it.
Doesn't that take away the entire objective of a retreat? But I think, one of the challenges with emotions, there's a lot written about it. There's a lot of talk about it. But I think, one of the territories that I think we are not exploring very well is the idea of freedom from certain kinds of emotions. Mm-hmm. We spend a lot of time speaking about managing emotions. Yeah. And managing emotions is good. If you need to survive, managing emotions is useful. But we as humans, even if you take the most sort of, I call it very crass sort of representation of human aspiration, which is Maslow's hierarchy. Even if you take that model, the idea is that after certain kinds of management, you have to get into the process or experience of actualization of things. And actualization requires some sense or some experience of freedom from things. So we spend so much time managing emotions, rotating the kinds of emotion day in and day out, that we actually, again, to reuse the word imagination, that we can't imagine a life free of toxic emotions. We have simply taken it for granted that yes, stress can be minimized or fear or anxiety can be minimized, but we have to live with it, that we can't get rid of it. And I think that's a shame, That's a shame on sort of the aspects that we assume of what it means to be human. Humans are very funny creatures, actually, as you may have experienced, right? So, we love to take credit for anything good. But if any point somebody tells you, they point out your imperfections or inadequacy, we oftentimes resort to the statement, oh, I'm just a human being. When somebody tells you that you did an excellent job at something, when somebody tells you, oh, you are so generous, so kind, so brilliant, how many times have you responded to that compliment by saying, I'm just a human being? So to begin thinking, begin imagining that we don't need to simply manage certain things. If we recognize that it shouldn't exist, that if certain toxic emotional states are occupying tremendous bandwidth in my mind, yes, let's begin reducing it, but aspire to get rid of it. So
it's a very basic thing to Buddhism that we are all basically good, and that there were things that came out of that didn't require rules so much. But my background in one way was the Swedish Evangelical Covenant Church, and we did have rules. So that's why I was just hoping you had 5 of them for us. But we only really had one, and the sermons would just be the preacher would say, it's a really good idea to just be nice to people. That's about it. You'll have a better life. Then let's go down and drink coffee in the fellowship room. We just go drink a whole lot of coffee. That was the whole thing. Just be kind to other people. That was a lot, actually.
If you had to abide by just one rule, I think that's a great rule to have.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's a story about this Indian Buddhist teacher, Atisha, who's credited with bringing mind training tools to Tibet. And the story is that when he was in Tibet, rather than asking people in the morning when he would greet and, you say, hello, how are you? Or even the word tashi the leg that you heard earlier, he wouldn't greet people like that. The first sentence that would come out of his mouth when he saw people was, have you been kind today? It's not about any other sort of metrics around how you're living your life, but have you been kind today? And I think that's a good rule to begin with. And if you want more of it, I'm sure there are institutions, including Buddhism, that can give you 300 of those. But kindness, I think, is a good place to begin.
I'm going to switch over to death. I was really interested in your description of what happened to you at Varanasi, and seeing all of the bodies of the dead people, speaking of different ways to view time. Could you talk a little bit about what you saw there and what it meant to you?
Let me begin by paraphrasing a dear friend and mentor of mine, Thomas Keating.
Yeah.
And Thomas and I, we used to have a lot of elaborate conversations, and death was one of the topics that would come up. And he would say, Tenzin, death has a very bad PR in the West. We all have to go through it. We see it all around us, but it's somehow very cosmetic, And the thing about Varanasi, for those of you who haven't been there and so on, it's kind of a first teaching on naked awareness. There's no cosmetic enterprise to dead bodies. They are there, they're decaying, they are burned. And it's sort of this very vivid sight, sometimes traumatic sight, but very vivid sight in terms of what happens to the human body. But you also see all kinds of drama that occurs around the process of cremation and so on and so forth. But there were 2 things at that early age, because it was a recommendation by my teacher to go and spend time on cremation grounds. One was it gave you a different sense of what it meant to have a body. And you understood firsthand the temporal nature of this body. It changed the sense of relationship of how you identified with the body. It gave you a different sense of responsibility with what to do with the body. It wasn't so much as individuals these days talk about image issues with the body, loving your body or hating your body, which has become a big challenge in contemporary world. But it gave you sort of this realistic understanding of what this body was and what you did with your time in this body. And that's, it was the first teaching on time, that human beings are perhaps the only species that we know of that is so aware of its own mortality. Yes, we deny it. Sometimes we exaggerate it. Sometimes we romanticize it, meaning we have all this relationship with mortality. But the realistic understanding of mortality, to be able to view it in such a way that it enriches every life breath that you have. So that every moment that you're living, you recognize that this is the time. Because time, in this day and age, either we have too much of it or we have too little of it. We never have enough. We humans have very difficult time grasping the concept of enough. And time is one of those things. It's constantly fleeting. At one moment in your life, you seem there's abundance of time. Next moment, it's fleeting too fast. But it's the only resource that is not going to come back in this linear understanding of time. The only resource, your money, your health might get repaired at times, but time itself.
And yet we have such shallow understanding of it. I mean, constant questions, like starting with what time is it?
Yeah.
I mean, what time is it is a really amazing question. It's like, I was just asking about Varanasi because also a friend of mine, when she went there, she said, I didn't have that much of a connection to reincarnation or these ideas, but when I saw the body being, when I saw the head, the charred head chopped off the body, I thought, final place. And she was very shocked that she thought that, because she has this vague idea that she might come back in some form. But how does this idea for you of reincarnation affect your idea about time?
I think the worldview of reincarnation is interesting because it challenges the linear sense of time and space that we live in. Even with the book, oftentimes people I would be taking advice from, they would say, well, it's not chronological.
Oh boy.
and I would start thinking, this thing called chronology, it's an interesting view of time.
Yeah.
That why should it just move in this particular direction? And the Buddhists have, I would say a very sort of circular or spiral view of time. And we go back and forth in different forms. But reincarnation is an interesting thing because it's not, again, unique to Buddhism. Most Indic traditions have that. But there's a distinction that people oftentimes overlook between rebirth and reincarnation. Rebirth, everybody's going to come back, and everybody's going to come back as a version of themselves. But rebirth is where you will come back, but all of it is propelled by your karmic propensities. Reincarnation is where one has experienced some degree of freedom, so that it is not exactly driven just by karmic propensities. There is some will, again, in terms of where will I be, in what form will I be, and so on. But the beauty of reincarnation or rebirth or reincarnation is also that it truly helps you understand perspective. Meaning, because it tells you you're not always going to come back as humans. Right? So now you have to take your perspective as other species. One of my teachers, people used to come to him oftentimes, again, people romanticize this idea of past life and so on. He would say, I don't understand why people come asking about their past lives. If I tell them they were pigs or dogs in their past life, then they're not thrilled. They want to know they were kings or generals or emperors in some way. But that's not how rebirth works. So I think it's a beautiful sort of synthesis of perspective, of time, of space. And it truly takes you out of this linear understanding of time and space to be able to give you a broader view of how the world functions.
I think anybody whose mind jumps around a lot, like most of ours, the idea that things have a narrative is kind of crazy, because you're just remembering something that from 10 years ago, and suddenly it reminds you of this, and then you're here, and then we're jump cutting all the time in really complicated ways. So how we live in time is almost a kind of dreamscape of trying to understand consequence. I did ask one of my teachers once about the great wheel of karma, and I said, what happens if I'm going to admit just being a kind of a bit of a pessimist in certain ways. When everybody leaves this planet, let's say where there's no people left, what happens to the big wheel of karma? And he had a ready answer. Strangely, I said, "Oh, you know?" He said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "What?" He said, "That's why the Buddha talked about many universes."
In certain parts of the United States, Silicon Valley and so on, I've been observing that individuals actually are not that much interested in historicity of things. They're not much interested in history because they're dealing so much with the current and the future, but they don't understand the influence of the past to the present to the future. But also they are very much concerned about, as we were talking about this earlier, in terms of the irony of things, that they're concerned about being original. So I was giving example of a CEO of a tech company who wanted to do something around compassion. And we were having this conversation, and he would preface every sentence by saying, I think I have come up with an idea, or I think this way. And so I told this gentleman, I said, you do realize that there's at least 800 years of literature on what you're talking about just in the Western civilization, just among the Greeks and other. I said, no, but I'm thinking of it in a new way.
Improved, a new and improved way.
And the thing is, how do you know you're thinking of it in a new way unless you have a reference point of some sort? So I think it's a disservice in some form or the other, where we want to be original, we want to have the novelty, and one way of getting about it is by divorcing ourselves from any historical context.
So are you interested in changing that or trying to?
Yes, I think they will have to change that because, one of the things that we're also recognizing when we get to this in terms of the AI conversation, that a lot of it is driven by large language models criteria. But one of the things that is going to come up, that's already coming up, is for engineers to recognize that humans learn a lot more from contexts than just from language. So we have to come up with large context models.
Whoa, right. That's a whole different game.
And when you come into large context models, then you have to contextualize every aspect of language, of vocabulary, of sentence structure, syntax, and then you get back again into history. Thanks.
Whoa. I was just reading about a type of AI translation that was not having to do with definitions of words, but that would read the entire paragraph and get the gist of what was being said. So they make basically like what they call word clouds. Like they might make a word cloud of the word love. And then in French, they would make a word cloud of amour. And then they would shift these things until love and amour were talking to each other. And all the other things that weren't love or that were close to love, that were variations on love, would somehow match because they were said these are human feelings that are going to have their opposite number in other languages, but they're not going to necessarily match that word that we're using for it. So I thought that was a really monumentally radical way of thinking about translation.
I think so, yeah. I think it'll be helpful to create those kinds of reference points. But again, it's one of the things is that it's not unique. We just don't think about it in those terms these days. But if you look at the Greeks, when they try to define love, there are 4 different understandings of love, right? From eros to agape. Yeah. And it becomes almost like an aspirational trajectory. They're not suggesting that humans should deny one kind of love over the other kind of love. But how do you understand it? But in our society, it's a different kind of thing. But a friend of mine who was, I think she was the chief editor for Oxford Dictionary, and she spent a year at Stanford when we were doing this fellowship together. And she came one day to me and she said, I'm fascinated by Gen Z. And I said, why? And she said, well, they use like 6 different words for gender, and they use 6 different words for like love, And so you recognize that with this whole conversation around fluidity, that also changes our understanding between how we see love and so on.
One of the things that also stuck out for me in your book was how you can be a bit overzealous about changing the world. And I just want to read this short thing because I thought it was really beautifully written. Is it near when you call the world this house of cards? I think so. Anyway, I love that description of the world. We charge ahead to meet the enemy, but as long as our own minds are clouded and agitated, we inevitably fog. The lens we not only see more chaos in the world, but we contribute to that chaos. That filter means we don't even get an accurate diagnosis of the problem, whether inside us or out in the world, to be able to change effectively. And I could really, really relate to that because I feel like I know what's kind of wrong with the world somehow. But in order to push against that, I feel I need another way to think about it.
I think, one of the emphasis in many of the spiritual practices, but especially in the contemplative tradition, is this process of refinement. But part of the process of refinement is 2 things through which humans learn the most. One is perception and the other is perspective. And perception and perspective, they're constantly driven by our biases, implicit biases, belief biases, and so on. Meaning, what I see is not what I see. What I see is what is informed by my historical data of things, and I project, and that's what I see. And sometimes that also changes my ability to take another person's perspective, this precursor to mental pliancy or mental flexibility and so on. So I think, the beauty of the contemplative practices in that regard is that it's constantly interrogating this idea that, is this perception enough? Or is this perspective enough? So, can you go on refining it? Can you go on correcting it? Because again, we humans are only as good as our ability to self-correct. If we lose that ability to self-correct, then there is no growth. There's no spiritual growth, there's no mental growth, and so on. So I think that's where the push is, which is how do you refine your perception and perspective? And by doing that, you're constantly interrogating the biases that are.
Especially when we don't exactly know what perception is. That's the most mind-boggling fact that I've learned in the last few months is that, so when you look at a forest, what forest are you thinking about? Or, you kind of click into, without seeing it so much as you just kind of go, that's a forest, because you're comparing it to all the forests all the way back to the very first time you saw a little drawing of a forest in your 4-year-old book. I mean, what is seeing? So it's very, very mysterious in many ways.
And also the emotional tone that's oftentimes there behind perception. Imagine one day you wake up and it's a beautiful sunny day like this, flowers are blooming and so on. And you go out and it's a lovely day and people smile at you and you smile back at them and it's a wonderful world. Next morning you wake up, another spring day, but you had a bad cup of coffee or you got into an argument with somebody at home. Mind is a bit agitated. You walk out and people are smiling at you. And the first thought that comes to you is, what the hell are you smiling at? And you ask yourself, what has changed? You say, the external environment is pretty much similar to that of the previous day. But now the mind is agitated and it is interpreting the perception, the signals in a very different manner because of the difference in emotional tone.
Yeah, I agree. But I also have to say that in terms of perception and emotion,
yes.
And that's when that seems like the only time I can learn anything, when I'm just open to something that's to grief. Yeah.
If you look at many societies, and you look at the organized period of grieving or mourning, it was a designated period, of a month, 2 months, or so on. Because it wasn't just about grieving for the person or mourning for the person, but all the other forms of learning about yourself that takes place in the context of grief. Today we are trying to sort of artificially either shorten it too much or we prolong it too much. I think, finding the right balance in that regard. And it's hard to talk about balance when you're in a state of sorrow, especially in a state of deep sorrow. But sorrow is truly a deeply sort of opening experience.
Yeah. I've just been thinking about Mexico and how some of the first statues were made of mud, and that just really crumbled. And then the next sort of generation of statues were made of wood, and that got very brittle. It was always breaking. And the next generation was corn, and maize has a cellular structure that's more stable. It can resist more. And now our statues are made of data, and they look a lot like us. They kind of like, in a way, talk a little bit like us, but who they are, if they are anyone, or they're just a bunch of large language models, is how do you look at what's going on in that world?
Because we are talking about time, one thing that I am wondering, curious, concerned about is the notion of free time. One of the arguments that you keep hearing from folks who are designing AI is that humans will have a lot more free time once you start delegating tasks and work and so on. And my question is, humans, again, don't have very good history as a collective to use free time well. It ties again to the whole idea of what is a good life, what's a purposeful life, and so on. But this issue that it will be a real sort of commodity in terms of time. And if you were not working, if all your needs were met, if for some magical reason the universal basic income model starts panning out in some ways, all your needs are met, what would you do with your time? And can you sustain that model of using time until the end of life? Because at the same time, you're trying to live for 200 years. It's not just that you're worried about just the next 40, 60 years of your life.
Well, I think that's one of the ways that technology rushes in and says, you can be an artist.
Right.
And you can be a musician. Anyone can be, And I love this idea. I really do. And because I got into a strange conversation about this last week with, I've been working with a machine learning institute in Adelaide for about 6 years now on artificial intelligence. They were the two designers of this machine learning. They're writing the algorithms. And then there was a person who was an artist and a musician. One of the designers said to this guy, he said, well, you've spent that 10,000 hours practicing. What good is that? When you can just make something like this, because everyone can make a great photograph. And we can all make great photographs now. We can make videos. We can make films. Anyone can do that for not very much money. It's amazing. What to do with free time? You know how you're in an awkward moment and suddenly everybody turns to you? And you're like...
Well, you are the artist in the room.
Yeah, so I was just saying, and I am the artist who has spent the 10,000 hours doing stuff. And I have to say that while it's a really nice idea that your brain can just go, I'm going to make that movie and it's there. It's suddenly from my box to your box. It didn't go through the air even. It didn't go through... it's just pure digital information. It's like, boom, done. And I find that having a body is very, very informative. If you just try to keep doing stuff with it and seeing and noticing things with your eyes, smelling stuff, using your haptic senses, all of the stuff, it's called, I don't know, practicing or whatever it's called, but it does. Having a body is a big advantage because you can, there's a struggle involved in it as well. And just the rub of how difficult it is to do things, and that's all bypassed when it's just make a movie, boom, it's done, I'm not sure that's what people would use their free time for, though. This is my fear.
But there are other aspects of it. I think that will come up in mental illness, for example. One of the challenges is a simple observation again, that our sense of identity, for at least since Industrial Revolution, has been tied to our work. To the point that if you're in between jobs, or even if you're taking a sabbatical, and somebody says, "What are you doing?" You never say, "You're just enjoying your free time." You say, "You're working on a project, or you're working on a creative project, or you're in between projects where you're going to..." I think this sense of identity that is so deeply tethered to the idea of work, to the notion of work. And remember, in most theistic tradition, work was given as a punishment.
The work camps.
Right? So it's not like, you're desiring to work, but why is it that our sense of identity is tied to it? And when we don't have it, what is the mental and wellness cost around it?
Yeah, I remember when I was starting out as an artist and I was filing my income tax. And after about 4 years of doing this, the IRS got in touch with me and said, if you have this situation again next year, you have to declare your work a hobby. So I said, it kind of is a hobby, really. On a personal level, I could say that, like, one of my friends who's no longer with us, but he was a producer named Hal Wilner, and I have to say, this guy always had all the time in the world. I thought, I want to be like that. He was never like, whoa. No, he was like, hey, come over to my studio. I'm going to play you, and it'd be 6 hours later. You'd be listening. He had reset his whole thing, and he just became so expansive, and he was not worried in the way that most of the rest of us are about, what am I doing here? What am I accomplishing? He was just not doing that, and he got a lot done.
Thank you for listening to About Time. If you liked this program, you'll enjoy the Rubin's Awaken podcast, which explores the dynamic path to enlightenment. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or online at rubinmuseum.org. And be sure to follow us on social media at Rubin Museum. Please also consider supporting the museum's global mission to present Himalayan art and its insights by becoming a friend of the Rubin at rubinmuseum.org/friends. About Time was supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council. About Time was also made possible by the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of the Office of Governor Kathy Hochul and the New York State Legislature. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening, and until next time.